السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. طلاب المرحلة الثالثة كلية الصيدلة جامعة بابل. Our topic today is Physiology of Respiratory System. What is the meaning of respiration? Respiration is the process whereby oxygen from the air is transferred to the blood and carbon dioxide is eliminated from our body. Functionally, the respiratory system can be divided into two parts. The first, which is called the conducting airways, through which air moves as it passes between the atmosphere and the lung. The other part is called the respiratory tissue of the lung, where gas exchange takes place. Let's talk about conducting airways. The conducting airways consist of the nasal passages, mouth, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and the bronchioles. These airways are important. Why? Because air we breathe is warmed, filtered, and moistened. As it moves through these structures, heat is transferred to the air from the blood flowing through the walls of the respiratory passages. The mucociliary blanket removes foreign materials, and water from the mucous membrane is used to moisten the air. So, the conducting airways are very important for warming, filtering, and moistening the air which we are breathe. The conducting airways are lined with acidostratified columnar epithelium that contains a mucus-secreting goblet cells and cells that contain hair-like projection, which are called cilia. The epithelial layer gradually becomes thinner as it moves from the pseudostratified columnar epithelium of the bronchi to cuboidal epithelium of the bronchioles, and then a squamous epithelium of the alveoli, whereby the alveoli is composed of a one line of squamous epithelium cells. The mucus is produced by the goblet cells in the conducting airways from a layer called the mucociliary blanket that protect the respiratory system by entrapping dusts and other foreign particles that enter in the airways. The cilia, which constantly are in motion, move the mucociliary blanket with its entrapped particles toward the oropharynx, from which it is expectorated or swallowed. Cigarette smoking will slow down or paralyze the motility of the cilia, and this slowing allows residue from tobacco smoke, dust, and other particles to accumulate in the lungs, decreasing the efficiency of this pulmonary defense mechanism. As you see in this graph, these are the cells. This is the basement membrane, the columnar epithelium, and these are the cilia. This is the mucus, which is secreted from the mucus secreting cells, and this is the mucus layer that trapped the inhaled particles and the dust particles. The airways are kept moist by the water contained in the mucus layer. Under normal conditions, approximately 1 pint of water per day is lost in humidifying the air we are breathed. This is humidification process is very important for our body, Why? Because if we breathe a non-humidified air, it will be difficult for us to continue respiratory function. During fever, the water vapor in the lungs increase, causing more water to be lost from the respiratory mucosa. In addition, fever usually is accompanied by an increase in the respiratory rate, so that more air passes through the airways, withdrawing moisture from its mucous surface. If you think why during fever our respiratory rates increase, we have to think about this condition. Why during fever the respiratory rates increase? What is the benefit of increasing respiratory rate during fever to our body? As you see in the bronchus, there is multiple layers of cells. These layers will continue to decrease. In the bronchiole, it will be converted into simple epithelium, and then in the alveoli, it is one layer of squamous epithelium. Let's talk about the nasopharyngeal airway, which is important for our respiratory function. As air passes through the nasal passages, it is filtered, warmed, and humidified. The outer nasal passages are lined with a coarse hair which filter and trap dust and other large particles from the air. The upper portion of the nasal cavity is lined with a mucous membrane that contains a rich network of small blood vessels. This portion of the nasal cavity supplies the warmth and moisture to the air we breathe. The mouth serves as an alternative airway when the nasal passages are plugged or when there is need for the exchange of a large amounts of air, as occurs during exercise. During exercise, we can use the nasal passage and the mouth to inhale more amount of air. The oropharynx extends posteriorly from the soft palate to the epiglottis. The oropharynx is the only opening between the nose and mouth and the lung. Obstruction of the oropharynx will lead to immediate cessation of ventilation process. Now we will learn about the laryngotracheal airways. The larynx connects the oropharynx with the trachea. The walls of the larynx are supported by a firm cartilaginous structures that prevent collapse during inspiration. The function of the larynx are speech and protection of the lung from foreign substances. The cavity of the larynx is divided into two pairs of folds of mucous membrane stretching from the front to the back with an opening in the midline. The upper pair of folds are called the vestibular folds, and it has a protective function, while the lower pair of the folds has a cord-like margins. They are termed as the vocal cord. It means in Arabic الحبال الصوتية. These vocal cords are vibrating and they are required for making vocal sounds. The true vocal folds and the elongated opening between them are called the glottis. A complex set of muscles controls the opening and the closing of the glottis. Speech involves the intermittent release of expired air and opening and closing of the glottis. So speech is the result of intermittent release of expired air with opening and closing of the glottis. The epiglottis is located above the vocal folds. During swallowing, the free edges of the epiglottis move downward. During swallowing, it will move downwards to cover the larynx, thus routing the liquids and food into the esophagus and prevent passing of these substances into the lung. If the swallowing mechanism is partially or totally paralyzed, food and fluids can enter the airways instead of the esophagus when a person attempts to swallow. These substances, it means the fluid and liquids we are taking, these substances are not easily removed from the lung, and when they are pulled into the lungs, they can cause a serious inflammatory condition called aspiration pneumonia. It is called aspiration pneumonia. How about the tracheobronchial tree? Let's take a view about the tracheobronchial tree. Tracheobronchial tree consists of the trachea, bronchi, and bronchiole, and it can be viewed as a system of branching tubes. There are approximately 23 levels of branching, beginning with the conducting airways and ending with the respiratory airways, where gas exchange takes place. The trachea is a continuous tube that connects the larynx and the major bronchi of the lungs. The walls of the trachea are supported by a horseshoe-shaped cartilage, which prevents it from collapsing when there is a pressure in the thorax, and this pressure is more and more negative. The trachea divides to form the right and left primary bronchi, which are passed into the right and left lung. Each bronchus enters the lung through a slit, which is called the hilus. The structure of the primary bronchi is similar to that of the trachea, in that these airways are supported with a cartilaginous rings, and you understand what is the importance of this cartilaginous rings to prevent collapse of the branches of the bronchi and bronchiole. Each primary bronchus divided into secondary, or can be called lobular bronchi, which supply each of the loops of the lung. And as you know, there is 3 in the right lung and 2 in the left lung. The secondary bronchi or lobular bronchi are divided to form the segmental bronchi, which supply the bronchopulmonary segments of the lung. The bronchi continue to branch, forming smaller bronchi until they become terminal bronchioles. These terminal bronchioles are the smallest of the conducting airway. They are the smallest branch of the conducting airway. As these bronchi branch and become smaller, it will lose its cartilaginous support, and it will become thinner and then disappears at the level of respiratory bronchioles. So the cartilaginous support will be disappeared at the level of respiratory bronchioles. What is the definition of the lungs? Lungs are soft, spongy, cone-shaped organs that located side by side in the chest cavity. They are separated from each other by what is called the mediastinum. Mediastinum is the space between the lungs and its continents. It means the heart, blood vessels, lymph nodes, nerve fibers, thymus glands, and esophagus. All these structures are present in the chest cavity, and they are separated from each other by what is called the mediastinum. The upper part of the lung is called the apex, while the lower part is called the base. The lungs are divided into loops, which are 3 in the right lung and 2 in the left lung. As we know, gas exchange is the most important function of the lung. But the question is there any additional functions that are derived by the lung? Yes, there is an additional functions that are important, including inactivation of vasoactive substances such as bradykinin, which are important to convert the angiotensinogen 1 to angiotensin 2. Also, lungs serve as a reservoir of blood storage in our body. The lung cell produce heparin, and the heparin producing cells are particularly abundant in the capillaries of the lung, where small clots may be trapped. So, in addition to gas exchange function, the lung acts as a source of heparin producing cells. They serve as a reservoir for blood storage, and also they inactivate vasoactive substances such as bradykinin, and they convert the angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. You can return to the renal system lectures and see what is the conversion of angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, how it can occur in the lung, and which is important for the regulation of blood pressure and sodium and water balance in our body. The gas exchange function of the lung takes place in the lobules. Each lobule, which is the smallest functional unit of the lung, is supplied by an arteriole, the pulmonary capillaries, and the venules. Gas exchange takes place in the terminal respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts and alveolar sac. So, gas exchange, what do we mean by gas exchange? The gas exchange occurs between the lung and blood in the capillaries. So, the gas exchange takes place in the terminal respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts and alveolar sacs. Blood enters the lobules through the pulmonary artery and exits through the pulmonary vein. Lymphatic structures surround the lobules and aid in the removal of plasma proteins and other particles from the interstitial spaces. Unlike large bronchi, the respiratory bronchioles are lined with a simple epithelium and also lack the cartilaginous support of the larger airways. The alveolar sac are cup-shaped, thin-walled structures that are separated from each other by a thin alveolar septa. This is the shape of the lungs, the trachea, and the branching system of the airways. Most of the septa are occupied by a single network of capillaries, so that blood is exposed to air on both sides. That's the importance of a simple squamous epithelial layer. There are approximately 300 million alveoli in the adult lung, with a total surface area of approximately 50 to 100 meters square. Unlike the bronchioles, which are tubes with their own separate walls, the alveoli are interconnecting space that have no separate walls. As a result of this arrangement, there is a continual mixing of air in the alveolar structures. This is the importance of alveolar structure. They are not separated by a wall, so that there is a continual mixing of air in the alveolar structure, and this will help us to take more and more oxygen during the ventilatory process. The alveolar structures are composed of two types of cells. Type 1 alveolar cell, which are flat squamous epithelial cells across which gas exchange take place. So, gas exchange take place by type 1 alveolar cells, while type 2 alveolar cells, which produce surfactant. What is surfactant? What is the definition of surfactant? Surfactant is a lipoprotein substance that decreases the surface tension in the alveoli, and also the alveoli contain alveolar macrophages. What is the importance of macrophage in the alveolar cells? Macrophages are responsible for removal of offending substances from alveolar epithelium. So, alveolar cells are two types. Type 1, which is responsible for gas exchange, and type 2, which is responsible for production of surfactant, and we have the macrophages, which are responsible for removing of foreign substances from alveolar epithelium. Now, we have to learn how lung circulation takes place. As you know, lungs are provided with a dual blood supply, the pulmonary and bronchial circulation. The pulmonary circulation arises from the pulmonary artery and provides for the gas exchange function of the lungs. It is important for gas exchange function of the lung. The deoxygenated blood leaves the right heart through the pulmonary artery, which divides into left pulmonary artery that enters the left lung and the right pulmonary artery that enters the right lung. And then the oxygenated blood is returned to the heart by a way of pulmonary veins which empty into the left atrium. While bronchial circulation distributes blood to the conducting airways and supporting structures of the lung. The lung as a whole need blood supply. So how the lung get its blood supply, how the lung and the conducting airways get their blood supply? They get their blood supply through the bronchial circulation, which distribute blood to the conducting airways and supporting structures of the lung. The bronchial circulation has a secondary function of warming and dehumidifying incoming air as it moves through the conducting airways. The bronchial arteries arise from the thoracic aorta and enter to the lung, with the major bronchi supplying them and other lung structures with oxygen. What do you know about the pleura? What is the pleura? The pleura is a thin, transparent, double-layered serous membrane which lines the thoracic cavity and encase the lung. The outer layer is called the parietal layer, which lies adjacent to the chest wall, and the inner layer, which is called the visceral layer, adheres to the outer surface of the lung. So, parietal layer lies adjacent to the chest wall, while the visceral layer, which are the inner layer, adhere to the outer surface of the lung. The parietal pleura forms part of the mediastinum and lines the inner wall of the thoracic cavity. A thin film of serous fluid separates the two pleural layers. A thin film of serous fluid is present between the two parietal and visceral pleura, and this fluid allows the two layers to glide over each other and yet hold together, so there is no separation between the lung and the chest wall. The pleural cavity is potential space in which serous fluid or inflammatory exudate can be accumulated, and this is called a pleural effusion. Sometimes, due to apathological conditions, this pleural cavity is inflamed, producing a serous fluid or inflammatory exudate, and this is called a pleural effusion, which is abnormal collection of fluid or exudate in the pleural cavity. These are the bronchioles, the pulmonary veins, the lymphatics, and the pulmonary arteries. This is the end of our lecture. Thank you for your attention, and we will continue in the other lecture. Goodbye.